So this is the time of year when video game awards start coming around, things like the Golden Joystick, the video game awards themselves, the VGAs. And as I'm looking through all the categories, the nominees and everything, I'm just thinking to myself, we can do better than this. I think that these are good events overall for gaming because they do give recognition to games and game studios, developers, and people that really have done amazing work for video games and need to be recognized. And at the same time, every year, these things incur a lot of controversy, which can be good and can be bad. But the reason why I want to talk about it is because I feel like we try to apply this general rubric overall to video games, and we're kind of taking it from examples mostly in film and music, right? Those are the two places where you have award shows that are well known, the Grammys, the Emmys, whatever, Golden Globes. Anyway, the idea is pretty simple. They try to break it down as formulaically as possible, but to be perfectly honest with you, I feel like video games are just a different breed. So for example, they'll do something like Best RPG, okay? You took a big genre, role-playing game. There are many different types. There are action RPGs, there are CRPGs, there are whatever you want to call them, JRPGs, classic RPGs, whatever you want to say, strategy RPGs. There are so many different types of these games, and it's very difficult to try and cram them all into one single category. So for the Video Game Awards with the Best RPG, you get stuff like Baldur's Gate 3, which everyone would say, okay, that's your favorite in pretty much every category it gets nominated for. As for Game of the Year this year, it's definitely up there. It's probably going to win. There's a really good chance of it. But look at the other nominees that are in there. Final Fantasy 16, which a lot of people would say is sort of an RPG, doesn't have that many RPG elements, is more of an action game. Lies of P, which is a Souls-like RPG. If you looked at Souls-likes in general, you would have to say they are a role-playing game. You are building up your character and going through a story. Souls-likes, by the very definition, are role-playing games, but they're very different type, right? They do involve action, but they're not really action RPGs. Very, very different type of game. To me, the most classically RPG of this whole group is Sea of Stars, which is the old school turn-based, I mean literally dialing back the clock kind of RPG. Can it compete with all of the depth and complexity of Baldur's Gate 3? Can it compete with the action gameplay of Lies of P or Final Fantasy 16? I mean, they're just so different. I don't know how you compare them. I don't mind having these big general categories, but I do feel like Sea of Stars, if it doesn't win against Baldur's Gate 3 or Lies of P, it needs to have its own category, right? Because if you asked me what's the best Souls-like of 2023, I would absolutely say Lies of P. I don't even think it's close. I don't even think it's remotely close. But is it going to beat Baldur's Gate 3? Hard to say. The other nominee here is Starfield. Now, Starfield is a Bethesda RPG. So Oblivion and Elder Scrolls, those types of things. It's the same thing, but in space. It has a lot of controversy to it. You want to nominate it for Best RPG, okay, whatever. But then you don't see something like Octopath Traveler 2, which I think in general most people would say is a better game. So it limits not only who you can nominate and how they're recognized, but it pits games against each other which are so drastically different, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It also narrows down the number of games that you can actually recognize. Because if you don't want to make a separate Souls-like or a separate classic RPG or JRPG or a separate action RPG, you don't want to make those all different categories, you don't want this show to be 5 hours long, okay, but then you're going to only be able to recognize a much smaller number of games. And should all these games get recognized? Yeah, I think so. At least the vast majority of them. There are a few nominees I don't really agree with. I'm not the biggest fan of Starfield, to be perfectly honest with you. There has got to be a better way. There's got to be a next level of depth that we can go to that's going to recognize more of these companies who have really done an amazing job. If you think back to past games and you look at an overall genre, you will find genre-defining games that were not recognized. But the reason that they went on to become genre-defining games is because they either created the genre or they furthered it in some way. While I do think that it's necessary to have some kind of recognition or award ceremony, I think if we can take a little bit of extra depth to it, add another layer, maybe make it some kind of like a you have your big category of best RPG, but break it down a little bit. You have your subcategories. I mean, maybe it's its own sort of tournament within each of these different things, these different categories for the types of games. I don't know, but there's something better we can do. At the end of the day, gaming is about competition. It's either you versus the game or you versus other players, but in some way it's some kind of a competition. And I feel like for giving the recognition that is deserved by these games, you could say, oh, the nomination alone is enough. But again, you know, something like Octopath Traveler 2, I don't think is nominated for a single thing, and it's definitely one of the best RPGs of the year. Or something like Armored Core 6, which is nominated for a couple of categories, but it didn't get to sniff Best Game of the Year. And the categories that it's in, you could argue whether or not it's going to really fit into those. Then you end up with situations like Best Action Game or Best Action Adventure Game. So this is trying to get a little bit of that depth. And I'm sure you'll have some folks that complain that, well, what the heck's the difference between these two different things? But I think the nominees do give you a pretty decent idea. For example, you're going to see something like Armored Core 6 in Best Action Game and something like Tears of the Kingdom in Best Action Adventure Game. Okay, that kind of makes sense to me. And you also run into situations where games like Dead Island 2 is nominated, and I think overall, if you polled the audience, so to speak, at least in terms of people who've played a lot of these games, maybe not people who are dead set Dead Island fans, I don't know how many of those people there are, but I know there are some. It has a cult following from the old game. You'd say, why the heck is this game in here? It doesn't make any sense with the other things that are there. Now, when looking for solutions, I think one of the issues that comes up is the very first thing you'd think of is, well, why don't you just let the audience vote, right? Let them decide based off of whatever they feel like, vote for the games they want to, and that's it. Well, two problems with this. Number one, there is no way that even 1/100th of the number of people who are going to vote in these things have played every single game in a category. It's pretty much impossible. I've played a good number of these games, and I still have many of these games either in my backlog or I've never heard of them before. So when it comes to a title like Best Debut Indie Game, you're going to have Cocoon, Dredge, Pizza Tower, Venba, and Viewfinder. I have to literally look down and read it off the screen because I don't know any of these games except for Dredge, and I've heard the name Pizza Tower, and maybe Cocoon. I maybe have watched a video on Venba. I haven't gotten to play any of these games. Dredge I definitely want to play, but it makes it kind of tough, right? So if you leave it open to the public, then you run into the problem of, well, I voted on everything else. I guess I'll click something here, right? I'll pick something. Well, I heard my buddy talk about Pizza Tower. I'll vote for that. Or I've seen some reviews on Dredge. People like that. I'll click it. So you end up with a situation where you have an uninformed voter voting, right? And you're going to end up with that in many situations. Then you run into the other big issue that's come up mostly because of the Video Game Awards, which is re-releases, remasters, remake, whatever you want to call them. But a game based off of a prior game, and that being part of the discussion, especially when it comes to the big awards like Best Game of the Year. So you end up with a game like Resident Evil 4, which the original game is regarded as a masterpiece. And here it is again, re-released. It's in my backlog. I haven't gotten to play it yet. Every review I've heard or seen has said it's amazing, that you absolutely must play it, that it should be in there for Game of the Year. Okay, yes. Can I throw a but in there? Because it was also a Game of the Year contender way back when it originally released. And then you get into a sticky subject of, well, how different does it have to be in order for it to be considered? For example, Final Fantasy VII Remake is an extremely different game than Final Fantasy VII, right? They were released decades apart. It's nowhere near the same type of game. One is an old polygon 3D game / 2D game that is a traditional turn-based RPG. Then you have the brand new one, which is also action-based. It's really fully 3D, a 3D environment. It has very different systems, very different architecture, very different story even, because it only takes part of the story and it really fleshes it out. So who's to say the difference between Resident Evil 4 being considered and that being okay, or Final Fantasy VII Remake being considered and for that to be okay, and the follow-ups, because I think it's 2 more games coming in that series, all to make up the original game? Well, That's a tough question, right? Me personally, I'm not a big fan of remakes being part of the Game of the Year discussion, just because you have such a strong foundation where you started from, and for that to be the basis of this new game, which is really taking the same story or very similar story or very similar mechanics, if not the same mechanics, and just updating it on new hardware because it's faster, it's more powerful, it can do more, we can make it a better game. Obviously, that's a great thing, but I don't know if that should be in competition against games that actually came out and were created in 2023. Now, if you want to really follow this down the rabbit hole, you can get to sequels and prequels and games that fall within the same structure. I've mentioned Octopath Traveler 2 a couple times. It's the almost exact same structure as Octopath Traveler 1. Or Tears of the Kingdom, another great example. When it first came out, some people, I would say the very loud minority of people, said, well, it's basically DLC for Breath of the Wild. I even made a video on it. But again, where's the cutoff line? Where do you say, I can't put Resident Evil 4 in there, but Tears of the Kingdom is different enough for me to include that? I don't know. I almost feel like, again, it's a great idea to have a subcategory. So maybe it's original IP, best new original, or best original IP, or something like that. Or have a separate category for remasters and remakes. And then you can have Metroid Prime Remastered, and Dead Space, and Resident Evil 4, and Super Mario RPG that's coming out this week. You can have those games go against each other. But I understand the criticism when you nominate something like Resident Evil 4 Remake as best game of the year, and then you're leaving out so many other games that could have used that recognition. To me, the biggest snub for the Video Game Awards for Best Game of the Year is Hi-Fi Rush. I know that the Xbox people are really upset that Starfield wasn't put in there for Game of the Year, and if you watched some of my playthrough of Starfield, you would know I was really bored to tears of that game. And I get it, it's its own thing, it's Bethesda, you have to understand it. I've never really gotten into Bethesda games before, so I get it, maybe I'm not the right person to talk about it. But between the two, I think Xbox fans should be upset about Hi-Fi Rush, not Starfield. Either way, you could say that Resident Evil 4 Remake took a slot there that could have very well gone to Hi-Fi Rush and probably deserved to go to Hi-Fi Rush, at least if you were considering brand new IPs. I think the other thing that happens too is you end up with categories like Best Community Support, and that becomes a really sticky subject. So you've got a game like Cyberpunk 2077, it gets bug fixes, it gets the 2.0 update which changes some mechanics, it adds a bunch to the game, you've now got the expansion and everyone's in love with it, we need to recognize this game. And listen, I played Cyberpunk from day one, I platinumed it back when it was a buggy mess on PS5 using the PS4 version. I like Cyberpunk. But it is a game that's now old, and we're talking about a DLC for that game. So when you're talking about best community support, I mean, would you say it was worse community support when it was originally released, and now it's better a few years later? So now we recognize them? Or maybe you make it a separate award and you go to recognize a developer who has put in the time to support their community or to repair the relationship with their community, or I don't know exactly how you would word it, but you come up with something that makes more sense for what you're trying to do. Should CD Projekt Red be recognized for resurrecting Cyberpunk 2077 and fixing the bugs and sticking with it and not just folding and making a new studio and dropping the whole thing and having this broken mess of a game still sitting out there? I mean, I think it should be recognized, right? But is that best community support? I don't know. And in general, you'd probably say that live service games and free-to-plays and those types of things are probably going to be the ones in the running for the best community support, but then they have their own category as well. I know that we try to define these things. If I read off best community support, recognizing a game for outstanding community support, transparency and responsiveness, inclusive of social media activity and game updates / patches. They are really trying to narrow it down. But then you put in a game like Baldur's Gate 3, which has been pretty solid from the start, right? I mean, again, maybe I'm not the right person to talk about it because I don't have a lot of experience with that game. I have a physical on order from PlayAsia. I'm definitely going to try and play it before the year is over. But then you put Destiny 2 in there, which from all the accounts of the Destiny 2 players that I've heard, I mean, they are furious with the developers of that game. They are not fans of the new update. They are not fans of the latest DLC and the plan and where that story's going, and they think that it really isn't making much sense and it's not being resolved properly. You end up in these situations where you say, why is Destiny 2 nominated? Or you say, well, why is Cyberpunk nominated? Why is Cyberpunk 2077 being recognized for best ongoing game? That makes no sense. It's ongoing updates. It has no multiplayer. It has no general like seasonal interactions or anything like that. It just has had major updates and now it has a DLC. It doesn't make any sense, right? You have to do something to try and make these delineations. A good example is something like No Man's Sky. No Man's Sky has had huge updates. This game, from day one to where it is, huge difference, right? And in terms of an ongoing game, it's multiplayer. So it makes much more sense for a game like that. And it makes almost no sense for a game like Cyberpunk 2077. But I think both should be recognized because they both did an amazing job with resurrecting their games, sticking with their game, and making all the necessary changes to get it to a point where they're actually realizing the value of the game for their customers. Now let's get to another subject that it's a little sore one for me. And I've put out my own poll on this because I want to see what the heck the deal is. But fighting game of the year. Listen, you're going to think I'm biased because I'm making Street Fighter 6 content and I've been putting out a series on that. It's not getting a lot of views, but it's no secret I love the game. I have put a ton of time into the game. I'm going to have more content coming out for it, etc. But the thing that drives me insane is every single poll I see with Street Fighter 6 versus Mortal Kombat 1. It's not that Mortal Kombat 1 wins, right? It's okay if Mortal Kombat wins over Street Fighter 6, you like it better, okay, whatever. It's that when I see the polls, they're like 91% to 9%. How is that a thing? So I'm hoping that that's related to the actual channels that are posting those and that those specific viewers are voting for Mortal Kombat 1 because that's the content they're watching, that's the game they're playing. But if you look at the overall player base, Mortal Kombat 1 has a much larger player base than Street Fighter 6. However, if you ask any, okay, maybe not any, but if you ask almost any of the professional players, the people who play both, they play it competitively, which game is better, Mortal Kombat 1 or Street Fighter 6? Almost none of them will say Mortal Kombat 1, but Mortal Kombat 1 will win these polls 90% to 10% because of the player base. You cannot fix the game awards by making them a popularity contest, right? Otherwise, you'd have games like Pokemon winning when their game is broken and stupid, but because Pokemon has such a following, and listen, I'm not judging people who like Pokemon. I've played Pokemon games. I had a Pokemon Go phase I'm not terribly proud of, but it is what it is. It's still on my phone. I loved Arceus. But like Scarlet and Violet is a total dumpster fire, and the updates for the game are like DLCs and stuff, but they don't fix the core issues with the game. It still runs like absolute crap. But that could have been considered for Game of the Year or RPG of the Year or some stupid category just because of how popular Pokemon is. And that's the kind of thing we need to avoid. Again, you like Mortal Kombat 1 better than Street Fighter 6. It is what it is. I'm not in agreement with you. I think the vast majority of competitive players would not agree with you. I think from a spectator standpoint, Street Fighter 6 is a much better game to watch and to understand. And maybe this will be a separate thing altogether. But you cannot make these things a popularity contest, so that's not a solution. Again, you might have something like Starfield win over something like Baldur's Gate 3. Maybe not. Baldur's Gate 3 has been huge. You know, or maybe you have Tears of the Kingdom win over Baldur's Gate 3, but most people agree Baldur's Gate 3 should win. So where are we at? I haven't provided much in the way of solutions. Me personally, I would like to see these categories broken down a little bit better. You can have categories that you don't actually show up as part of the presentation. One of the things that these award shows do, they do present a lot of these awards off of screen, right? You don't actually see the person receiving the award, but they go through the category, they announce the winners. We could absolutely do that. So then you'd have like your classic RPG winner could be Sea of Stars. You could have your Souls-like winner be Lies of P. You could have your I don't know, you break up action any way you want to. Could be Armored Core 6, and then your strategy RPG could be whatever. Actually, they have strategy RPG. So you already have some of this stuff because you have best RPG and then you have best sim/strategy. And the really strategy is what? It's strategy RPGs for the most part, at least in this case. I mean, they included Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot and Fire Emblem Engage in that category. So that, for all intents and purposes, includes strategy RPG. It's just renamed a little bit differently. So it includes like City Skylines 2, which apparently is also an absolute disaster on release. So I would like to see more broken down categories. You don't need to present them all, but give these developers, give these creators their own limelight. Give them something they could throw on the box or something they can put on their splash screen or whatever they do for digital stuff, but give them something that they can put on their resume and build towards more successful games in the future. I want to see Sea of Stars be recognized. I want to see Lies of P be recognized. I want to see Armored Core 6 be recognized because as much as I love the Souls games, I also loved Armored Core 6. It's a fantastic game. Armored Core 6 has the best combat of any game I've played in 2023, and I kind of feel like it's going to get snubbed here if it doesn't win the best action game, which it very well may not win. The other thing that ends up happening here that we have to work towards avoiding in some way is when the game comes out in the year plays a huge role in how they're viewed coming into these award ceremonies. So for example, what are a couple of big games that are nominated for some things that probably should have been nominated for more or have a better chance of being recognized? Well, I already mentioned Hi-Fi Rush. How about Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom? I feel like it's really not that much in the consideration for a bunch of these categories. And I think it's partly because of how early on in the cycle it was picked up. So I'm providing a lot of questions, not a lot of solutions, and I understand that. But these are some of the things that I've been thinking about because overall, I think in general, people love this stuff. This calls attention to gaming. It kind of is a sort of validation, both for us as gamers to see our games that we loved for the year get nominated and win, and also encouragement to try and get them to keep producing these types of games that have been so successful and have been so influential. I do not want to get rid of these things. If anything, I'd like to see more of them, but there has to be a better way. So let me know in the comments down below, what do you think? What are some things that you would like to see changed about the Video Game Awards? What are some categories you'd like to see added? Maybe some taken away? I'm not a huge fan of Content Creator of the Year. I don't know how this is decided, how we came to these people, but I don't know if I know any of them. And how can we make some of these categories work despite the fact that not a lot of people play these games? When you talk about games for impact and these categories for accessibility as an example, that a lot of people aren't going to use the accessibility options from. But I know, for example, Street Fighter 6 has huge accessibility options that have allowed someone like Blind Warrior Sven to go to huge competitions like EVO and take part and actually win a few rounds and be competitive. So I get it, the job's not easy. The idea of the award ceremony is not easy. You're never gonna make everyone happy. Someone's gonna be out there who's upset that Starfield wasn't nominated. But at the end of the day, I think we can do better than what we're doing now. So sorry for all that rambling, but let's try to make it better. And let's also try to enjoy these things and support them, because as much as you may not like some of the nominations and those types of things, it's only going to give more incentive to these developers to strive for these lofty goals, as opposed to just settling for putting out another copy of Madden, or, well, it's not called FIFA anymore, right? They lost the license on it, or whatever, you know, just one more iteration, Call of Duty, what have you. We want to see innovation. We want to see games that press the envelope, that make other developers stand up at attention and say, we need to develop better and more immersive games for our fan base. And they will reward us not only through buying our game, but recognition when it comes to these award ceremonies. And that'll help us go towards the future with further development and getting backing for our big ideas. I hope this sparks a conversation. Let me know in the comments down below what you'd like to see changed about the Video Game Awards, or if you have ideas on how to fix some of these things. What do you think about some of my ideas? Like, for example, the tiered categories that kind of feed into each other to try and recognize some more games. So that's going to do it for today's video, but I've been Pyrus for Pyrus Gaming, and until next time, thank you for watching, and I will see you there.